The following is an excerpt from Tradcast Express number 137. This Tradcast was addressing the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes. That is, it was addressing those people who believed that they could recognize Francis as their pope, but resist his liturgical legislation. What is interesting about this particular argument is that it applies equally to all those who recognize Pius XII as a valid pope, but resist his Holy Week legislation.
These people consider themselves to be Orthodox traditional Catholics, right? And yet it does not occur to them that declaring a pope's universal disciplinary decision to be null and void is perhaps a little presumptuous and not something a layman or even a bishop or a cardinal has the power to do. But fools rush in where angels fear to tread.
Some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.
Writing to the Archbishop of Paris in 1885, Pope Leo XIII taught that, quote, if it should happen that those who have no right to do so should attribute authority to themselves, if they presume to become judges and teachers, if inferiors in the government of the universal church attempt or try to exert an influence different from that of the supreme authority, there follows a reversal of the true order. Many minds are thrown into confusion, and souls leave the right path. Unquote. And that is from the apostolic letter Epistola Tua of Pope Leo XIII. Now, what Pope Leo condemns here is exactly
one disputed question in traditionalist circles, particularly among Sedevacantists, concerns the 1955 Holy Week reforms of Pope Pius XII. On one side are priests like myself, who maintain that these reforms paved the way for the 1969 New Order of Mass of Paul VI, and were the work of the same sneaky modernist cabal that concocted the post-Vatican II reforms. For these reasons, we don't believe that we're bound by them, so we use the pre-1955 Holy Week and Missal. But some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.
According to the traditional Catholic magisterium, according to what's on the books, so to speak, and everyone can look this up for himself, it is for the Pope, for the Holy See alone, to regulate the sacred liturgy, and it is for the cardinals, the bishops, priests, and laity to follow the directives of the Holy See with filial submission. Their job is not to resist, but precisely to fall straight in line. Don't believe it? Well, here's what Pope Pius XII taught about it in 1947. Quote, the sovereign pontiff alone enjoys the right to recognize and establish any practice touching the worship of God, to introduce and approve new rites, as also to modify those he judges to require modification. Bishops, for their part, have the right and duty carefully to watch over the exact observance of the prescriptions of the sacred canons respecting divine worship. Private individuals, therefore, even though they be clerics, may not be left to decide for themselves in these holy and venerable matters, involving as they do the religious life of Christian society, along with the exercise of the priesthood of Jesus Christ and worship of God, concerned as they are with the honor due to the Blessed Trinity, the Word incarnate and His august Mother, and the other saints, and with the salvation of souls as well. For the same reason, no private person has any authority to regulate external practices of this kind, which are intimately bound up with church discipline and with the order, unity, and concord of the mystical body, and frequently even with the integrity of Catholic faith itself." Unquote. That was Pope Pius XII, encyclical Mediator Dei, paragraph 58. So that is the traditional Roman Catholic teaching.
But some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.
What he's really opposing is simply the doctrine of the Church. Pius XII, Leo XIII, and many others, of course. I just don't want to quote them all here now. Of course, we're not saying that the bishops and cardinals who accepted the new Mass did the right thing in embracing that awful Novus Ordo liturgy. We're only saying that if you start from the premise that Paul VI is the true Pope, then accepting the new Mass is the only legitimate way of acting.
And if you start from the premise that Pius XII is a valid Pope, then accepting his Holy Week reform is the only legitimate way of acting.
What the bishops and cardinals should have done in 1969 is reject the new Mass and Paul VI. Well, they really should have done that at Vatican II already, but right now, let's stay focused on just the topic of the liturgy. Yes, they should have rejected not just the new Mass itself, they should have also rejected the man who imposed it because, and this is the key to it all, a true Catholic Pope is incapable of instituting a rite of Mass that is evil, harmful, heretical, sacrilegious, and even invalid. Now, when we say that a pope is incapable of doing that, we don't mean that he can do it and then everyone has to resist it and declare it null and void. We mean, rather, that God will prevent him from doing it. The pope would drop dead before he could put a signature on a document like the Constitution of Paul VI promulgating the new Mass, called Missale Romanum. Again, don't believe it? In the 16th century, the Council of Trent proclaimed, quote, "If anyone says that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs which the Catholic Church uses in the celebration of Masses are incentives to impiety rather than the services of piety, let him be anathema," unquote. That's Council of Trent, Session 22, Canon 7. You can find it in Denzinger, number 954. So if you believe that the ceremonies of the new Mass are incentives to impiety, then the only way you can say that is if Paul VI wasn't a true pope. Otherwise, you incur the anathema of Trent.
How then do those who disregard the liturgical reforms of Pius XII hope to avoid falling under the anathema of Trent? They acknowledge Pius XII as a valid pope, and yet they refuse to obey his liturgical legislation. They attempt to justify their position by arguing that the liturgy of Pius XII was not harmful at the time that it was promulgated, but rather they argue it became harmful over time.
A church law that through changed circumstances becomes harmful ceases to bind.
God is not mocked. To say that the approved liturgy of the Church can become harmful over time is simply a variation of that same condemned proposition. But notwithstanding the fact that they are using a condemned proposition, they still utterly fail to demonstrate exactly how the liturgy of Pius XII has become harmful.
These reforms paved the way for the 1969 New Order of Mass of Paul VI, and were the work of the same sneaky modernist cabal that concocted the post-Vatican II reforms.
They attempt to justify their disobedience by arguing that years later, some of these men involved in the liturgical reforms went on to give us the Novus Ordo, a guilt by association or kind of neo-Donatism. But the liturgy of the Church does not depend on the personal holiness of individual churchmen.
There is nothing in the Pius XII changes that would be contrary to faith or offensive to faith.
See, this is why Sedevacantism matters. The whole traditionalist resistance to the Vatican II Church stands or falls with that question, the Pope question. It is the linchpin that provides the solid theological foundation for refusing the Novus Ordo religion. Or consider Pope Pius XII. In his encyclical letter Mystici Corporis, paragraph 66, he writes, quote, "Certainly the loving mother," and here he's talking about Holy Mother Church, "certainly the loving mother is spotless in the sacraments by which she gives birth to and nourishes her children," unquote. So the clear Catholic doctrine is that the Pope alone judges concerning the sacred liturgy, and that God prevents the Pope from instituting a liturgical rite that contradicts the faith or is impious or is harmful in any other way. And it is for that reason, because they had that proper Catholic understanding, that almost all the bishops and cardinals in 1969 loyally submitted to the new Mass of Paul VI.
Some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.
The problem wasn't an exaggerated understanding of the papacy. The problem was that the man who gave them the new Mass was not, in fact, the Pope. He was an impostor. Now, I know this raises all kinds of questions about how could this happen and so on, but for all intents and purposes, the fact remains that we know he wasn't the Pope. That is a necessary conclusion. These people have the audacity to substitute their opinions for the judgment and the laws of the Pope.
We don't believe that we're bound by them, so we use the pre-1955 Holy Week and Missal.
Look, once you set down the principle that the Pope, the Vicar of Christ and head of the Catholic Church, can establish a liturgical law, and yet individual bloggers, professors, journalists, priests, even bishops or cardinals can just kind of announce to the world that the decree has no force, for whatever reason, then the papacy is over. And if the papacy is over, then Catholicism is over. No, I don't mean that Catholicism is over when there is no Pope. I mean that if you deny that the Pope has supreme and definitive authority, then you have no papacy at all. Then you've changed the dogma on the papacy, and then you no longer have Catholicism. Then you have a different religion.
Some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.
When in 1773 Pope Clement XIV abolished the Jesuits, they were abolished. Tradition or no tradition. That's how it works. The religious order of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, did not exist from 1773 until 1814, when Pope Pius VII reestablished it. Even if you want to say that Pope Clement sinned by abolishing them, and it was a very controversial move at the time, and he certainly didn't do it with gusto, but just felt it was the lesser evil given the unjust political pressures against the Church. Even if Pope Clement sinned in suppressing the Jesuits, suppressed they were. St. Alphonsus Liguori, whose feast day is today, and who was alive at the time, he was grieved by Pope Clement's decision, but he didn't pretend that it wasn't valid, and he didn't tell people to disobey. The Pope, any true Pope, has genuine, supreme, and final authority over the entire Church. His liturgical decrees, his teachings, his laws are authoritative and binding on consciences.
But Father Cicada tacitly admits that there is nothing harmful about Pius XII's liturgical reforms.
If you think that the last missal of the last true Pope should be the last word on the form of the liturgy you want to last forever, fine, and you're welcome to it.
If the missal of Pius XII was harmful, why would he say that we were welcome to use it? Those who do not accept the liturgical reforms of Pius XII don't argue that Pius XII was not a valid pope, and they don't argue that his reforms were impious or contrary to the faith.
There is nothing in the Pius XII changes that would be contrary to faith or offensive to faith.
The truth is, they reject his liturgical reforms because they simply prefer the older missal. As Sedevacantists, we believe there is currently no pope, but we hope and pray that someday soon this irregular situation will be resolved and we will finally have a pope again. But what then? What will happen when he proclaims a new disciplinary law? Strictly speaking, every new law changes what came before. That is, every new law changes existing tradition. No doubt there will be those who will declare any new disciplinary law goes against tradition and therefore must be resisted. You can take the priest out of a cone, but it is a little more difficult to take the spirit of a cone out of the priest.
Some priests just keep rattling on about disobedience.